Hey guys, in today's video I want to talk about the evolution of Roger Federer, how his personality on the court changed throughout the years, but not only that, also his strokes have changed quite a bit. How do I know this? Well, thanks to the Wimbledon YouTube channel. They just posted the boys junior final from 1998 where Federer played Irakli Labadze, and I watched this match and I draw several conclusions from watching Federer at an early age. It is a big difference the way he behaved on the court and the way he played in that junior final in 1998 compared to the way we all know Federer as the GOAT, the guy who has all the strokes in the book. He's the most elegant player in the history of the game. It wasn't quite like that back in 1998, and that's what I want to discuss in today's video in great detail. Now, I'm not going to feature any clips of this match because Wimbledon will claim my video, but I'm going to put a link of this junior final in the pinned comment below and you can take a look. And I'm telling you, the first thing that you will notice from this match is Federer's body language and Federer's overall attitude. It is very reminiscent, and you're going to be surprised when I say this, of Nick Kyrgios. It is nothing like the Federer that we all got to know on the tennis court. It is a player who is constantly talking to himself, muttering, and overall has kind of a slouched body language. And the first impression you will get from watching Federer in the junior final is that overall his body language is very negative, which is nothing like his body language later on in his career. It was the ultimate positive, confident body language, and he's known to be a player who rarely even utters a single word. The only audible thing you will ever hear from Roger Federer in his prime is a "come on" or a "come yet," but this wasn't the case back in the day. So in this junior match, Federer was muttering to himself. He was very frequently saying "schön, schön," kind of a sarcastic way of saying nice to himself after missing a shot. And the funny thing is that despite being so negative on the court, he played extremely well and won that match against a really quality player called Irakli Labadze. I'm probably butchering the name, but this was a phenomenal player. He made it to 42 in the world. You'll see that this is an extremely high level of play. And one of the things that I noticed watching the Wimbledon final from 1998 is how fast the grass was. This match was an incredibly fast speed. I'm going to say it was a faster speed than a lot of the matches that I played today. Now in 1998, the men's final was Pete Sampras against Goran Ivanisevic, where Pete Sampras won in a tight 5-setter. And it was exactly that match and many other finals between Sampras and Ivanisevic that forced Wimbledon to slow down the courts, because back in those days, the grass was simply too fast and there was barely any rallies. Which brings me to the way Federer was playing. It is a quite complex thing to analyze, but I'm going to try to explain it in a simple way. Federer's strokes were not the same strokes that you know of Federer. They were different. And let's start off with the serve. See, when Federer came on tour, I wasn't really a big fan of his serve. Right off the get-go, I know it didn't look quite right. There was something a little bit off. I understand that Federer's serve is regarded as the most beautiful serve in the world and everybody's trying to copy it, but I'm someone who has done a tremendous amount of research on the serve, and in my opinion, Federer's serve is not the most beautiful serve. There are other servers on tour who have more of a flowing, rhythmic motion that accelerates more slow to fast. What I don't like about Federer's serve is something that struck me immediately when I saw him play in the early 2000s was a fast rhythm on the bottom portion of the serve. So he does this movement very fast, and he therefore is forced to pause a little bit around the trophy phase. And this is something that's not a deal breaker, but it is also not the absolute best way to serve. It's not the optimal way to serve by any means. Now, Federer can pull it off, and he is one of the greatest servers of all time, no doubt about it. But for that reason, because of that fast movement on the bottom portion of the serve and that slight pause, I never thought of Federer's serve to be the absolute best in the world. However, this is going to surprise you that in that junior final, his serve looked a lot more like Sampras' serve. So these movements that are fast on the bottom is something that Federer added later on in his career. So if you watch that junior match from 1998, Federer's serve was definitely slower on the bottom and there was a more of a pronounced lag, and his serve looked a lot more like the Sampras serve. Now, could Federer have served better throughout his career if he kept this style? I actually think he would have. I don't think he had the optimal serve. If you compared Federer's serve to Sampras's serve, I would not make an argument about saying that Sampras's serve is better than Federer's serve. In my mind, the way Sampras serves is absolutely the more technically sound way to hit a tennis serve, for the reason that I explained before. It's a more continuous, fluid rhythm, and the acceleration is happening more slow to fast, and Sampras is not forced to make that slight pause around the trophy phase. So for that reason, I do think that Federer's serve looked better in that junior boys final. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that his serve was better, because if you look at him, he was obviously a lanky, thin kid without a lot of muscle. So as he got older, he put on a lot of muscles, he became stronger. So of course, Federer was serving a lot faster than in that junior final later on in his career. There's no doubt about that, and he was probably serving better as well. But just from the optics, just from the fundamental aspect of serving, in my opinion, the way Federer served in that junior final was better than the way he served later on in his career. Now let's get on to the forehand. What you will see on that boys junior final is something that's really interesting. The amount of times that Federer goes on the same side of the body on his finish. I would say it was around 80% in that match. And the reason for that is that Federer had a takeback that was much longer than the takeback he has now. There was definitely a higher position of the racket, and the racket was going further back. Now you got to remember that Federer has always had more of a straight arm forehand, even in those days. And if we combine the fact that Federer's a type of player who's a lanky type of player, who likes keeping the racket far away from him, this was always the case. Even when I saw Federer play at the age of 10 years old, he always had this kind of lanky look where the racket is very far away from his body. The fact that he was taking it back a little bit further and taking it a little higher, he was often late on that super fast grass court back in 1998. For that reason, he would be forced to go this way. He did, however, hit a few typical Federer style forehands, inside out winners, but they were far and few compared to the, let's call it a reverse forehand. He was forced to hit a reverse forehand because the preparation on his forehand was much longer. This is something that Federer corrected very quickly as he progressed to the ATP Tour. Did this thing get corrected by itself, or is it something that Federer consciously adjusted? I have no way of knowing that. We would have to ask Roger. It is possible that the speed of the ATP Tour was much higher and Federer was forced to adapt to the speed and shorten things back here. Or it also could be the case that his coach back in those days told him to make the preparation stage on the forehand a little bit smaller, to have more time with that full extension that he always had on his forehand. Now, having said all that, his forehand in that junior boys final was still phenomenal. He won that match 4-4. Okay, so if you win junior Wimbledon, you're not going to win that tournament if you have a bad forehand. So the forehand was still elite level. It was still phenomenal, but I'm comparing it to Federer's forehand in his prime. And it was definitely not as good in that junior final as it was later on in his career. And now let's transition to the backhand. And just like the forehand, the one-handed backhand from Federer in that boys junior final in 1998 looks nothing like the backhand that we'll all seen thousands of times, whether it be in slow motion on YouTube or watching Federer play matches. What we know from Federer's one-handed backhand is that it's one of the most beautiful shots in the history of tennis, and we know that he has a beautiful finish where the arm goes very high up, the butt cap is pointing forward, and it's just a phenomenal shot to look at. It is definitely a modern one-handed backhand because Federer's swing path is very vertical. So he puts a lot of topspin on his one-handed backhand. But I gotta tell you, from watching that junior final and paying close attention and going into slow motion and doing some analysis, Federer's one-handed backhand in that junior final was definitely more classic. And often, Federer did not have as much continuing rotation, number one. Number two, his finish was more like the classic finish where the tip of his racket was still pointing to Federer's left. So he didn't have a swing path that was as vertical as it was later on in his career. Now, does this mean that Federer had a bad backhand in that boys junior final? Not at all. It was still an elite one-handed backhand. He was still hitting backhand winners on the run. He was hitting the return winners. It's still an elite one-handed backhand, a phenomenal shot. But if we compare his backhand in that junior final compared to his backhand in his prime, of course, the topspin, it gives the ball a lot more control and gives the player the ability to hit the ball much harder. So yes, Federer's one-handed backhand improved tremendously as time went on. Now, something that I have always said about Federer, I never said it on YouTube, but I have a nickname for Federer. I sometimes call him Shanker. And when Federer used to play Nadal, I'm a huge Nadal fan, and I was anti-Federer in those matches. You guys that think I'm anti-Federer in general, that's not true. Watch my tribute on Roger Federer that I made a few days ago. I am a Federer fan, but I'm a bigger Rafa fan than I'm a Federer fan. And when he played Rafa, and when Federer started to shank some of his shots, I used to be very happy and I would scream, Shanker. So Federer has always had this issues of shanking forehands especially. And one disadvantage of a straight arm forehand is that you can make less adjustments at the moment of contact. With a bent arm forehand, there's more adjustments you can make, but when the arm is straight, it's kind of locked in. So you have to make sure that your timing is good, that your footwork is good, and that you're watching the ball correctly. So when this is not the case, you will miss hit some balls, especially if you have a racket with a smaller head size. So what I heard in this junior match was something that cracked me up, quite frankly. Not only was Federer shanking quite a few forehands, but he verbally said in Swiss German, Rahmen, Rahmen, Rahmen. He said that in the second set, up 5-3, about to win the match, which means frame, frame, frame. Federer acknowledged himself verbally on the court that he was shanking a lot of balls. And I do think that Federer shanks, as he upgraded his equipment and increased his racket head size, the shanks got less and less. And towards the end of his career, when he used the RF97, he barely shanked anything. So I do think that shanking has somewhat to do with his technique on the forehand, but it also has to do that he was playing with the racket head size that was extremely small. You can see in that match against Labadze, Labadze was using a Pro Staff Stefan Edberg 95 square inch, but Federer for a while kept using that Sampras Pro Staff that had a much smaller racket head size. And I just listened to an interview with Federer for the Laver Cup where he talked about how his coaches believed in him when he was young and they were patient with him and they saw the brilliance in him. The coaches would say that they saw 10 minutes of brilliance and then 30 minutes of not so much brilliant stuff coming from him at that young age. So he was inconsistent. Even though he won Junior Wimbledon, you can see the inconsistency more from a mental standpoint. And this continued as Federer started to play on the ATP Tour. In 2001, he won his first ATP tournament. In 2002, he won his first Masters tournament in Hamburg, Germany on clay. And then, of course, in 2003, he won his first Wimbledon. And Federer will tell you this himself, the most important win of Federer's career was in 2001 when he beat Sampras, who was still in his prime, in Wimbledon in the round of 16. But this really wasn't the game changer for Federer. Yes, he played absolutely phenomenal in that match, and they called this match the changing of the guards, but Federer lost the next match in Wimbledon to Mario Ancic in straight sets. So he wasn't as consistent as the Federer that we saw in 2002. And then once 2003 came and he won that first Wimbledon, now he truly became the GOAT. And the amazing thing about this Roger Federer evolution, and something that I can learn from and you guys can learn from, quite frankly, is how Federer was able to improve his deficiencies. So starting from 2002, Federer completely changed his personality on the court. He stopped muttering to himself and talking back to himself in a negative way. He stopped with the negative body language. He changed all that. He got rid of all that, which should teach us a lesson. I always say the vast majority of tennis players will not benefit from misbehaving on the court. There's maybe a handful of guys in the history of tennis who can draw from negative energy. Someone like a Jimmy Connors or John McEnroe, they drew on negative energy. But the vast majority of tennis players, including us, we play worse when we get negative. We play worse when we have a negative body language. We play worse when we start muttering negative things to ourselves. So we can all learn from Federer and start improving our personality on the tennis court. And guys, another thing that we can learn from Roger Federer is the following. No matter how good of a tennis player we think that we are, we're not. There's always room for improvement. Tennis is such a complex game. You can always get better. And think about what I'm saying here. Roger Federer, one of the most talented players in the history of tennis, wins Junior Wimbledon. A lot of tennis players would be happy with that. It would tell them that, hey, look, I just won Junior Wimbledon. I can keep going like this and be one of the greats. But no, for Federer, this wasn't enough. He always strived to improve every aspect of this game. And this is truly one of the most beautiful things about tennis, the fact that you can always improve no matter how good you are.